Everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Brian Thompson. I'm a programs manager for Can-Do MS. I'm coming to you from Avon, Colorado, and we have Roz in Maine, and we have Steve in Alexandria, Virginia, and wherever you're joining us from tonight, we welcome you to part one of our three-part young adult series. And tonight we're going to be talking about employment issues and some thinking about career planning. So we hope you find tonight informative. Hopefully you've logged on more or less easily. For those that join us for our regular webinar series, the number is a little different, so hopefully you're able to log on. If you are having issues, you can call GoToWebinar at 877-582-7011. Before we get started, I'd like to let you know that tonight's presentation will be archived and available on the Can-Do MS website, which is www.cando-ms.org. So as we go through tonight, if you miss anything, you'll be able to go back and see the archive version, and you'll also receive a PDF in an email after tonight's presentation. For those of you who are new to Can-Do MS, we deliver education programs focusing on wellness and quality of life and how to thrive living with MS. And we're really excited to have created and deliver this new three-part series for young adults. And regardless of age, there's a certain phase that living with MS can be more challenging because of the other issues going on in life. And some of the planning going on in life. And so we hope we can address some of those issues and answer some of those questions with a three-part webinar series. Tonight we're going to talk about employment, and then next week we're going to talk about mood and cognition and some of those changes in MS, and then we'll wrap up on September 4th talking about relationships and families. And each webinar will be accompanied with a podcast featuring a person living with MS to hear different stories and perspectives that'll go a lot with the topics that we're going to be talking about during these webinars. So thank you for joining us for this young adult series. We hope that tonight will be an interactive experience, so we'd really like for you to be part of the conversation. There will be a number of polling questions along the way that we're going to ask you to answer, and then we also will try to answer your questions. So in your chat box, which is the rectangle on the side of your screen, you can click on chat and you can submit questions right at the bottom there. And we're going to save about 10 or 15 minutes towards the end to try to answer as many questions as possible. And so now it's my honor to turn things over to tonight's speakers. We have Steve Nissen, who's a director at the National MS Society and really our guru on employment and benefits living with MS. And then a familiar face to many of you will be Roz Kalb, who's done a number of presentations for us and is also a clinical psychologist. So I'm going to turn things over to Steve and Roz.
So welcome, everybody. I'm excited to be part of this young adult series. And I just wanted to say that in my almost 40 years of working with MS, I've had the opportunity to work with many people through their disclosure decisions, their employment transitions, if and when they chose or needed to make those transitions, and also decisions about disability applications. So I'm just very pleased to be here working with Steve on this.
Great. Thanks so much, Roz. And thank you all so much for allowing me to be a part of tonight's program. I've been with actually the National MS Society for over 20 years, and really my entire career has been focused on really benefits, employment-related issues for people who are living with MS. So my background is that of a vocational rehabilitation counselor. So really, I am very familiar with disability and employment-related issues and concerns, and it's really my pleasure to share my experience with you all tonight. There actually have been several research studies really looking at the employment concerns specifically of people who are living with MS and the impact that their MS can have on employment. The research shows that the majority of people with MS, about 90%, do have some work experience at the time of diagnosis. That percentage drops to about 60%. But you jump ahead a few years, about 5 to 10 years down the road, the percentage of people who are still working drops to about 40 to 43%. That 40 to 43%, though still not great, is actually slightly better than previous studies. So there were studies that were done back in the mid-1980s that showed that 5 to 10 years after the diagnosis, the percentage of people working was actually only about 30 to 33%. But again, think back to the mid-1980s. That was prior to legal protections. So the Americans with Disabilities Act that we're going to talk about, that was passed into law in 1990. That predated any of the approved treatments. So we're thinking that some of that gradual increase in the percentage of people that are still working may be due to medical advances, legal protections, and just greater knowledge and awareness of the benefit that people with disabilities and people with MS have within the workplace. We've also learned from doing these studies is that the majority of people with MS are leaving voluntarily and are leaving prematurely. It doesn't mean that people don't still experience discrimination. They unfortunately do, and we're going to talk about some of the resources that you may be able to turn to just in case you come across that. But we believe some of the factors that are contributing to people leaving the workforce voluntarily, concerns about disclosure, not fully understanding their legal protections, not fully understanding what types of accommodations that might be available to them to help them manage their symptoms, the unpredictability, the variability of their symptoms, well-meaning people in that person's life saying, you know what, you've got enough on your plate, you've just been diagnosed with MS, why don't you maybe consider stopping work? We know that unemployment doesn't cure stress. In fact, it brings on another level of stress. Transportation barriers can be an issue, and also just not necessarily knowing where to turn to for that employment support and the resources. So again, that's really another one of the reasons why it's so important that you all are joining us tonight, because hopefully you're going to feel more knowledgeable about how to address those types of issues if they're some of the factors that you are coming across. We also know, based on the research, that the employment concerns of people who are living with MS do vary somewhat from other types of disability types. So oftentimes, given that with MS, it's an adult onset condition, so they have a wealth of experience, knowledge, the invisible factor, the invisible symptoms pose just yet another kind of different perspective for people with MS. So, but we definitely know that it's important for people to work, and work gives people a lot of things other than just financial benefits. So Roz, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about just the role that work plays and just why it's important to us.
Happy to. So in my conversations with people with MS over the years, they often centered on their feelings and concerns around employment. And I think if we step back and look at it, the work that we do for so many of us is really central to our identity. When you meet somebody at a cocktail party or you meet somebody in another social setting, one of the first things that people do is say, hello, I'm so-and-so, I'm A, and whatever it is that you do becomes part of your identity as you're introducing yourself to another person. So it's really core to who we are. And when that identity changes, there's tremendous feelings of loss and sort of bewilderment about what happened to this person that I thought that I was. The work that we do is also very key to our sense of self-esteem. We gain confidence, we gain feelings of pride and accomplishment from our productivity at work, no matter what our job is. It also provides us with intellectual stimulation, social stimulation with colleagues. And when we're very lucky, we also thoroughly enjoy our work. It is a great source of joy in our lives. So the threat of losing that, or the threat of having to change it, I think is very much on people's minds when they're diagnosed with a chronic illness. And as Steve said, that's all in addition to our concerns about supporting ourselves and our families. And when the threat of MS-related impairments sort of hangs over people's heads, they worry about where that financial support is going to come from. And for many families, people's employment is what provides the health insurance and other benefits that families need to thrive and to manage a disease like MS. So put all these together, and work is just very central to our sense of who we are. So Steve, when we talk about this, how might a person's employment change over the course of MS? What do you see the trajectory being?
Definitely. So we present this visual of the employment and benefits continuum. I definitely want everyone to keep in mind that it is seldom this linear, seldom this straightforward. People oftentimes move between and amongst all of these various steps. And I think it's important to realize that the type of support, the type of information, the type of the resources that a person might turn to may vary also as they do transition through these different steps along the way from employment to eventually at some point possibly considering going out on some sort of a disability benefit. I think what's important when we think about these different steps along this continuum is that really employment and MS is definitely a two-way street. We definitely know that multiple sclerosis can impact a person's employment situation, but also a person's employment situation can sometimes impact their multiple sclerosis. I've worked with many people throughout the years who, again, are giving so much to work that they don't have anything left for their significant other, for their family, for their recreation, for their wellness. So it really is kind of finding that balance. I think also what's important in terms of looking at this continuum, but also keeping in mind those of you that are participating on this call tonight, as a younger person who's living with MS, changing jobs is just something that we do. I think oftentimes we are expected to change jobs. I know some of the research shows that people change jobs or careers between 5 to 7 times. I've seen some studies that say it's as much to 10 to 12 times. So it's a normal stage for people to consider changing jobs or changing careers. But now that you've been diagnosed with MS, there just may be some additional things to take into consideration or to be aware of to know how best to manage that as you are navigating those sorts of general career decisions. You know, some of those things that you might be considering, again, disclosure, accommodations, finding those disability-friendly employers, they do exist out there. Really being aware of the benefits that would be needed for you or for your family. So if you see, you know, if you think of MS as being an adult onset disability, people may transition through these different stages working full time, not needing any sort of accommodations. As their disease changes or they become more aware of their legal protections, they might want to request some accommodations. They might consider cutting back, or maybe they might not be able to continue to work in their chosen field or their chosen occupation. So they may consider making a career change. At some point, they might contemplate separating from the workforce. That's when it would be important kind of to explore the benefits that might be available to them. You know, it's important to know what resources might be available to help as a person transitions through this. And it's definitely not this finite. I've worked with many people who have gone out on a disability retirement benefit, and then they want to return to work. And they do have that ability. There are different sorts of work incentives out there. So it is just a matter of realizing that people will oftentimes transition through these different decision points. And we're going to talk a little bit later, giving some kind of real life scenarios of people who really grappled with some of these different steps along this.
So Steve, we learned that the majority of people on this call are working and that the vast majority are experiencing some symptoms that are interfering with work. So as people go along this continuum, can you describe what some of the protections are, the legal protections that are there to help people?
Sure, I'd be more than happy to. And we'll definitely keep this brief. We could probably talk about legal protections for a long, long time. But just wanted to really, from my perspective, highlight the three most common key legal protections that people with MS should be familiar with, should at least be knowledgeable of, and know that that you have these at your disposal to tap into when and if you might need them. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, probably one of the most common laws or legal protections that people with disabilities at least have some familiarity with. This is a civil rights piece of legislation really designed to allow full participation of people with disabilities in the community, and hopefully designed to deter discrimination, or if it does occur, to know the process by which a person can file a complaint. This law was passed in 1990. It was fairly recently amended in actually 2008. The final enforcement regulations went into effect in 2009. And there are some key components of that, the Amendments Act, that do apply specifically to people who are living with MS. The ADA does apply to certain types of employers with 15 or more employees. The person does have to be able to perform the essential functions of the job, but the ADA does provide some key information as it pertains to disclosure and to requesting reasonable accommodations to allow that employee to perform those essential functions. Some states do actually offer some state or local protections that apply to employers with fewer than 15. These are, we'll talk about a resource later, the Fair Employment Practice Agencies, but there are protections out there. The Family and Medical Leave Act, or the FMLA, this is another key piece of legislation that I like people just to be aware of. This would allow a person to take some time off of work due to either your own medical condition or when caring for a significant other. You do need to have worked for that company for a minimum of 12 months. There needs to be 50 employees that work for that company. With FMLA, the federal is you're allowed up to 12 weeks of job protected leave. It is leave without pay, but during that period of time, the employer does continue your benefits. Some states, again, similar to the ADA, some states do offer some greater protection. Some states offer more than the 12 months. I think it's important to realize that those 12 months don't have to be taken all at one time. So if a person's going through the diagnosis process and missing work and they don't have leave, if they have exhausted their leave and they need time off for treatment, they would be able to tap into the FMLA on that kind of like an intermittent basis. And COBRA really focuses on health insurance coverage. We know that for people with MS, maintaining the health insurance is key. So this is a law that's oftentimes used when a person is considering changing jobs or leaving the workforce. Again, as a young adult, you might consider a career change. When you change that job, there might be a waiting period until your new insurance kicks in. So COBRA would allow you to continue on that previous employer's insurance plan. The initial period of time is 18 months. If you leave due to disability, that can be extended up to the 29 months. The cost of the premium does fall on the employee, so it can be a costly option, but oftentimes I counsel people to think about what the cost of not having insurance and just kind of running that risk. So it definitely is something to weigh. So, but with really kind of all three of these legal protections, there's a certain level of disclosure that a person might need to do in order to tap into the protections. So we definitely feel like that disclosure is something that deserves a lot of, or a fairly significant amount of time and attention tonight. So Roz, from your experience, what are some of the things that people should consider in terms of disclosing their MS?
So I think in general, the main things that you want to be asking yourself, no matter when or how you're choosing to disclose, is who needs to know, and what do those people need to know about your MS, and when is it important for them to know? So the reason there's this little graphic on the screen is that gold circle in the center is really the people closest to you, your family, your loved ones, the people who interact with you in a daily or intimate way. Those are the people that probably need to know what's going on with you first. And then over time, you might gradually share the information about your MS with a wider and wider circle of people. Somewhere in there, you're going to need to make decisions about employment, but this is really sort of general disclosure issues, and I would encourage you to look at the disclosure information on the National MS Society's website, because they can actually help you think through the questions of who, when, why, and what you're going to be sharing. The whole disclosure issue is stressful, particularly when you think of the fact that most of MS is not visible to other people. In fact, what those around you see is really only the tip of the iceberg. If you're having some mobility issues, or if your legs are stiff, or you have some tremor in your hands, maybe people will see that. But all the other symptoms like fatigue and cognitive changes, pain, bladder symptoms, the world can't see them. So you're struggling to function around other people or at work, knowing that a lot of the things that are getting in your way are not visible. So you have to make decisions about how much of that you want to share. But as Steve's going to talk about, within the workplace, if you're having difficulty with symptoms that are getting in the way and perhaps you need accommodations, at that point, you may need to disclose some information about your health status to your employer. Now, we have a lot of slides about disclosure, but I think we're going to need to move through those very quickly, actually. But we're going to leave you with resources to help you understand the details of all of this, and the slides will be available for you to see, as Brian pointed out. So Steve, when you're advising people about disclosure in the workplace, what are your key recommendations?
Definitely. So really the disclosure conversation is looking at kind of both the legal reasons for disclosure and the practical reasons for disclosure. We definitely know that this is probably one of the most common dilemmas, and we really call it a disclosure dilemma because people do really need to weigh the pros and cons, the risks and the benefits. And in a couple slides, we're going to spell out just what some of those pros and cons are that we hear from folks that I work with. But this definitely can be a stressful time. Oftentimes, I do get asked questions, what is the appropriate time? Before the interview, you see here, at the interview, upon the offer, once a job starts, never. I always say this is a very personal decision to make. I can never say yes, definitely do disclose, or no, definitely don't. Oftentimes when I'm counseling people about this decision, it's more a question of what's going on that's making you lean towards or lean away from disclosure, and let's try to figure out how to address those concerns. Generally speaking, at that interview is your chance to be interviewing that employer as much as for them to be interviewing you. So my general suggestion is, why put up the red flag? The exception is if you might need an accommodation for that job interview, say you're meeting with somebody and you do use a piece of mobility equipment, you want to make sure that that building's accessible. So there may be a certain conversation that may need to be had prior to. Doesn't mean that you need to necessarily say that you've been diagnosed with MS, but hey, I want you to know I use a walker or I use a scooter, so can I just make sure that we're going to be meeting someplace that's going to be accessible to me? Just so that way then that employer is not surprised also when you are coming through the door. Again, so at the interview, before the interview, like I said, usually that interview, I usually don't encourage. Upon the offer, that sometimes when people may consider, because you've obviously demonstrated yourself as being the person who's been chosen for that job. I've worked with some folks who have waited until they start in the job for a couple weeks or a couple months. Let's get a sense of, can I perform the essential functions of this job? Do I actually need any accommodations? If I don't, I might not need to actually disclose. But from a practical perspective, again, some of those advantages that we're going to talk about, reducing stress, those sorts of things. So it definitely is a very personal decision. The other thing to just be aware of is that sometimes, depending on the type of employer that you are actually applying for, there is a self-identification that employers may be specifically looking to hire people with disabilities. You see here Section 503. This is a Department of Labor regulation, which is challenging federal government contractors to have 7% of their workforce comprised of people with disabilities. So there's a self-ID form that does ask if you are living with a disability, and multiple sclerosis is one of those conditions listed. People get very nervous when they see that form. That's not disclosing, that's used for data collection, but it is something just to be aware of, that based on the employer, they may be doing some targeted outreach to hire people with disabilities. So hopefully they may be a little more receptive to that time when and if you do choose to formally disclose and possibly to request, to request an accommodation. So this next slide just talks about some of the advantages, the pros. Again, you see these here on the screen, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time other than to differentiate the legal reasons for disclosure and some of those practical or the emotional reasons. So from a legal perspective, the advantages of disclosing is that it does allow you the right to request an accommodation. Again, the ADA says if you can perform the essential functions of the job and you don't need any accommodations, you don't have to disclose. But if you do need accommodations, then you do need to disclose. So from a legal perspective, that's, in a way, the hard and fast time when you would really have to disclose is to request that accommodation. But from an emotional or practical reason, people might feel like that they're keeping a deep, dark secret. We know that people get stressed out about this. So what is it that we need to do in order to try to minimize the stress? It allows you to do that education, to be open with your colleagues. You may just be open to explore your benefits, whether it's health insurance, private disability, life insurance, long-term care insurance, which oftentimes may be available through those group sponsored plans, and not kind of in the general open market. And you may just feel more comfortable. I think the disadvantages that we hear from folks, I think the ultimate fear is that they're going to be terminated. That they're going to be discriminated against, and that employer is going to find some reason to let that person go. They're not going to be seen, or they're not going to be considered for those promotions or for the career advancement. They don't want to be seen as being different or getting preferential treatment by their colleagues. So again, these are just some of the factors to weigh in deciding what's right for you. Again, no two people are the same, no two employers are the same. So it definitely is something that utilizing the resources, we'll show here shortly, the National MS Society's website that deals with workplace and employment concerns does have that disclosure tool that Roz mentioned that does really kind of talk a person through who's the right person, what are your reasons, what do you say, and does have some worksheets to allow people that exercise of actually writing out some of those, the pros and cons. So some kind of takeaways when it comes to disclosure. This is definitely something that's worthwhile to think about. Even if you don't plan on disclosing now, it's always something that you may be grappling with at some point living and working with MS. So I say here, think about it, script it, practice it. Just know that once it's out there, it is out there. There's no taking it back. So you want to be the one to control how much information gets out there, who that information is shared with, when is the appropriate time, using sound bites, keeping it simple. Don't go into your full laundry list of your full history with MS and copies of medical records and all those sorts of things. Unfortunately, I've seen people who have done that. Keep it simple, keep it conversational. The who, I always stress, this could be someone from HR, this could be a direct supervisor, this could be based on how your employer is structured. There could be a benefits or a disability specialist. So part of that is doing your homework to figure out who's the appropriate person, when is the right time, again, prior to being hired, once that offer is made, once you've started working, once you've been working for that company for a period of time, and just keep in mind the why. Again, thinking about those pros and cons, the advantages and the disadvantages. So there's a sample disclosure script that I oftentimes use with folks that I'm working with. It seems like a pretty straightforward script, and for the most part, I think it works. And you see here the 4 different components of that script. Disclosing the condition, even that's a question to ponder. Initially, a person might not need to give an actual medical diagnosis, but can use more broad language. I have a chronic condition, or I have a chronic illness that causes fatigue or difficulty with my memory, but not naming it can also lead to a lot of questions from that employer's perspective, worried that it's something fatal or something contagious or something worse than MS. So even that's that decision for that oftentimes people need to grapple with. Relating it to the individual symptoms. So again, not a laundry list, but keep it work related. What are the main symptoms that might impact a person in the workplace? Requesting the accommodations. You don't want to say, these are the problems that I'm having and you have to deal with it. It's, these are the problems that I'm having, but here are some solutions that will help me to continue to be an effective and efficient worker. And that's that final component, finishing on the positive note. You really want to try to convey that this is a win-win. I'm coming to you, I'm sharing this in confidence. I've already come to you with solutions, so you can be certain that you're going to continue to get great work out of me. So it is really presenting it in a way that hopefully will go over well with the employer. So, and again, you just see here, really the bulk of this responsibility does fall on you, the employee. Again, so just that importance of doing your homework, planning ahead. Roz, you had mentioned just a couple minutes ago that, again, so oftentimes people might not be able to see the symptoms. So can you maybe speak a little bit about just the impact of the invisible or non-apparent symptoms?
Sure. So I've already talked about this a little, but I think, you know, everybody newly diagnosed with MS, particularly people living with those invisible symptoms, are used to hearing, but you look so good. And that's a very challenging message from people around you, because sometimes it's paying you a compliment, but sometimes it's indicating, well, they don't see what the big deal is because you look good. So why are you having difficulties, or why would you need accommodations of any sort? And I think employees with MS are often worried about being perceived as getting special treatment or getting let off the hook. And so they don't want to create any difficulties with their colleagues. But I think the key concept for you to keep in mind here is that invisible symptoms of MS can be at least as disabling, if not more, than some of the more obvious physical challenges. Fatigue and cognitive changes are the two most common reasons that people leave the workforce early, and neither one of those is visible to managers or to colleagues. So I think it's particularly important that you do this kind of scripting that Steve is talking about, so that you can describe the symptoms that you have and their impact on the work that you're trying to do, along with your suggested accommodations that would help you thrive in the workplace in spite of fatigue or cognitive changes. It's not a reason, just because symptoms are invisible, it's not a reason for you to shy away from requesting accommodations. In fact, it may be even more of a reason to ask for them. So Steve, can you just walk us quickly through some of the kinds of accommodations that people with MS can ask for?
Sure. And again, I'm really just gonna like highlight some of the most common ones. Know that, you know, everybody's different, every job's different, every person's symptoms are different. But what we have definitely seen is that there are a lot of useful accommodation strategies that can be put into place to help a person maintain employment for as long as they choose to. So from a technology perspective, things like voice recognition software, just making sure that your office is set up ergonomically correct. Looking at fatigue and minimizing the amount of walking that is needed. So just putting your workspace by the part of the office that requires you to visit a lot. Telecommuting, telework, we have seen this be an amazing accommodation strategy for people who are living with MS, whether it's flexible scheduling, telecommuting. These oftentimes don't have to be and aren't full-time work at home. There definitely are some jobs that are kind of advertised to be work at home, but knowing how to request that work at home as an accommodation, know that the accommodations that you need and that you might request might change over time. So just as we know that with your MS, your symptoms can change, they might come and go, you might experience new symptoms. So this is a bit of an ongoing topic to think about, because the accommodations that you request now might not be appropriate 6 months down the road or two years down the road. I think with like all of these accommodations, and on the next couple slides, you're going to see some more practical ideas. These sorts of accommodations, the ideas might come from talking with your healthcare providers. We're going to talk about the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN. This is an amazing resource that can really help to brainstorm practical accommodation strategies. It's a free federal service. So we'll talk about them in just a couple slides here. You may be able to bounce ideas off of a trusted friend or a family member. And also just you yourself have learned probably some practical strategies to help you manage these symptoms just in your day-to-day life, but that might translate into the workplace too. So this next slide just is for your reference. Again, Roz has mentioned fatigue and cognitive symptoms. We know these are two of the most common symptoms that lead people to leave the workforce prematurely because they don't necessarily know how to manage these symptoms. So you see here, again, flexibility is going to be something that comes up again and again. Cognitive symptoms, looking at your physical, your work environment, trying to reduce the distractions, utilizing some of kind of the built-in reminders, temperature sensitivity, something as basic as putting a fan on your desk can make the world of difference. The next slide, again, just some different symptoms, fine motor. Again, here's where maybe some of that technology can come into play. Dragon Naturally Speaking or voice recognition software, which is a voice to text software. Gross motor, if you do use a cane, a scooter, a walker, just making sure that your physical office is accessible to you, raising the height of your desk, getting getting a reserved parking spot, something that basic can make the world of difference. Vision difficulty, looking at lighting, looking at ways to enlarge the font. Again, there's so many different sorts of accessibility factors that are built into computers. And then this last slide, again, just some of the other symptoms. Again, we always put the disclaimer, we know that most people aren't going to experience all of these symptoms, so I don't want people to feel overwhelmed by seeing them. We just wanted to give some practical accommodation examples for some of the more common symptoms that we hear people talk about. I think what you've seen here is that a lot of these accommodation strategies are practical things that aren't going to cost, hopefully, a lot of money, or they might not cost any money at all. If there's an empty office space, if there's an empty cube, research has shown that most of the accommodations that people with disabilities can benefit from, not just people with MS, they don't cost anything, or when they do, the average cost is less than $500. So I always want people to think about that. This really shouldn't be an overly costly request that you bring to your employer. So we're going to talk for a few minutes just about some 3 real-life scenarios, folks that Roz and I have worked with throughout the years, that people did deal with a lot of these key employment issues and concerns that we have discussed tonight. So Patty was a woman that I worked with several years ago. You see here, 34-year-old African-American woman, diagnosed 7 years before I started working with her, single, no children. She had been self-employed as an interior designer, had a very successful interior decorating firm, side business. She also ran a small kind of furniture gallery. So she had her clients, but also a physical storefront too. Her key symptoms did include some vision problems, mobility challenges, tremor in her dominant hand. The vision symptoms actually was affecting her color vision primarily. So again, think about this as an interior decorator, not being able to see the colors. The mobility challenges also was impacting her ability. We have a very large kind of design center here in Washington, DC, that she would need to go to pick out fabrics and those sorts of things, and it was just becoming physically difficult for her to manage that warehouse. So she did a lot of soul searching. And ultimately made the decision that it was really time for her to transition, to shut down her own self-employment, her own business. And we spent a lot of time talking about her transferability of skills, looking at a career change. How can you use this experience, this successful business, but move into doing something different? So, where she wound up, again, really looking at that transferability of skills, she was such a creative and artistic person that she decided to focus her job search on kind of office administration types of jobs, but in a creative type of environment, a creative work environment. So she was applying for jobs with architecture firms and with design firms, but more in that kind of like admin role, more the behind the scenes jobs. She ultimately was hired as the as the office administrator for a local architecture firm, and she loved being in that type of environment. She was surrounded by creative people. She was familiar with the language, the terminology, and people saw her as more than just the person that was answering the phone and sending bills. They really saw her as a valued member of the team because she could bring that type of experience. She did request, and she was successfully given, a variety of different types of accommodations, using a computer, using some assistive tech, again, really to help minimize the impact of the tremor, and really just being able to use that transferable skills, but in a different environment. She really saw this as a career change, but still able to use what she loved. So Roz, I'm wondering, based on kind of Patty's experience, if maybe you can comment about the relevance of Patty using those transferable skills as she realized that that career change was necessary for her.
So if you remember back to where we started, one of the things we talked about is that the critical role of people's work in their personal identities, their sense of self, their self-esteem. And I think what Patty was very fortunate and foresighted in her job search was to find a place where she continued to feel good about herself, where she felt that her skills and past experience as an owner of a business, all were valued by the people around her. So she didn't have to give up many of the things that she felt good about. So I think your message about looking at the skills and the attributes that you bring to work that are most important to you and looking for other ways to use them is a really, really important message. So now I want to introduce us to somebody else, a woman named Martina. She, when I was working with her, was a 36-year-old Hispanic woman who'd recently been diagnosed with MS, and she taught high school history. Her initial symptoms included a lot of discomfort in her limbs, numbness and tingling, severe fatigue, and very early on she had problems with her memory, with thinking, and with organizational skills. And anybody who spent any time in a high school history class knows that a teacher needs to have all of those just in order to survive. So she very quickly was seeing the impact of MS on her work. She was a fabulous teacher and prided herself on that. And these changes made life difficult. She became quite depressed, very withdrawn and angry. And at that point, under some pressure from her partner and her friends, she was brought to see a psychologist, me, at the MS treatment center. They actually bribed her with a beer to get her to come. But she began a regimen of talk therapy and eventually started some antidepressant medication, which helped with her mood, certainly helped with her anger, her resentment, and enabled her to begin to problem solve what she needed to do around her work. So she was fortunate to work in a very good school system. She disclosed to her employer and requested and received accommodations. She needed to have an air conditioner in the classroom so she could deal with the heat in the summer months. She requested a teacher's aide to help her with some of the tasks in the classroom. But most importantly, after quite a bit of discussion, Martina disclosed her MS to her students and engaged her high school students to help her in the classroom. They did the writing on the blackboard for her. When she couldn't think of a word, she would point to somebody and say, "What's the word I'm trying to think of?" And the class would help her come up with the words. They helped her in all kinds of ways to get through her teaching day while they were still able to really benefit from her fabulous knowledge and teaching skills. She then started an MS walk team with all of her students in this high school and had one of the largest walk teams in Westchester, New York. And it was all these kids who became fabulously invested in raising money for MS and supporting their teacher, whom they loved. So this is a fairly unique situation with a very happy ending. She received complete support from the administration, from her fellow teachers, from students and parents. She went on at some point to be elected president of the teachers union, and worked out until retirement age. So Steve, obviously it doesn't always work this way.
I wish, honestly, that all of the people that I work with had such a successful outcome as Martina, but we know that it's not always that case. So just some things to keep in mind if you do face some challenges in terms of disclosing and requesting accommodations. I mean, it sounds basic, but don't get defensive. I think it's important to be open to questions and to discussion. This is supposed to be, supposed to be like an interaction.
So first, I want to ask a polling question of everybody. So if you disclose to your employer, would you expect this type of positive response?
Roz, I think we're having a little issue with the polling question, so it closed quickly. So not everyone got to vote, but something to think about.
All right, so Steve, sorry about that, because I would have liked to hear the response to that. So Steve, what can you advise people when things don't go quite as smoothly?
Right.
So first, I want to ask a polling question of everybody. So if you disclose to your employer, would you expect this type of positive response?
Roz, I think we're having a little issue with the polling question, so it closed quickly. So not everyone got to vote, but something to think about.
All right, so Steve, sorry about that, because I would have liked to hear the response to that. So Steve, what can you advise people when things don't go quite as smoothly as did for Martina?
I wish, honestly, that all of the people that I work with had such a successful outcome as Martina, but we know that it's not always that case. So just some things to keep in mind if you do face some challenges in terms of disclosing and requesting accommodations. I mean, it sounds basic, but don't get defensive. I think it's important to be open to questions and to discussion. This is supposed to be, supposed to be like an interactive process. That's language actually within the ADA. So there may need to be some back and forth. And part of that back and forth is to have a backup plan. Determine what's a must-have versus what's might prefer to have. Because if you sense some pushback from the employer, prioritize your list. Know what you would like to ask for that is really the most important, and let's focus first on that. Don't go in with your full laundry list of the accommodations. Again, we want you as much as you can to be flexible, to really sell this as that this is really going to be a win-win. I'm going to get what I need, but this is also going to help you and help your bottom line, because you're going to be able to retain me as a valued employee, and I'm going to be more productive and more efficient. Be prepared, do your homework, become familiar with the ADA, know what you can do if things do go poorly, or don't go as planned. I don't want to say if that they're going to go poorly, if they just don't go as planned. Do your homework, know what accommodations, again, reach out to the Job Accommodation Network. But if you do feel like that you are being discriminated against post-disclosure, it goes really poorly, it's shut down, accommodations are flat out denied, know that you have the ability to tap into legal and protection resources. You see here just some of the key ones. So the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is the enforcer of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The state fair employment practice agencies, as I mentioned before, there's sometimes some state laws that apply to employers with fewer than 15 employees, so you may be able to file a complaint with them. The Job Accommodation Network, they're an amazing resource not only in dealing with brainstorming practical accommodation strategies, but really fully understanding the ADA, disclosure, and the National MS Society. I'll show you a website here shortly of where you can turn and how you can get in touch with an MS Navigator to become more familiar with what sorts of protections and resources might be appropriate.
I just need to throw in a comment here because Steve won't say it, but he leads a phenomenal employments and benefit team at the National MS Society. And if you call the society with specific questions about employment or employment challenges, you have a very highly trained team of people who have the expertise to give you more details about this and answer all your questions. So don't hesitate to call him. He's sitting there waiting for you to call him.
Thank you, Roz, for that little plug. I'll take it. So the last person I wanted to talk very quickly about is somebody that I worked with. His name is Michael. If we can get those slides back up.
They were eaten by the poll.
Yeah. So while we're waiting, so when you see the slide, Michael is a 43-year-old Caucasian man diagnosed with MS about 15 years ago. So again, he's been living with MS for a fairly significant amount of time. Married, does have one daughter who is 10, works as a hospital administrator. So again, went to school really with the intent to work within the medical field, more in an administrative capacity. Symptoms include fatigue, cognitive issues, balance. Fairly recently, he moved from a smaller medical practice to a larger medical setting, to a bigger hospital. And one of the reasons for that was because they did offer greater employer-sponsored benefits. So he's been in that job, or he was in that job for a period of time, and those symptoms were becoming more and more difficult to manage. So based on that, we've got a quick polling question, I think, if we have time, Brian, still, to ask you what you think that Michael should do.
1 second here. We have time for one more polling question.
Okay. We just wanted to, based briefly on that presentation of Michael, what do you think Michael should do next? Speak with his doctor, search for some vocational rehab services, consult with a financial planner, request accommodations, apply for the disability benefits?
They've been listening, Steve.
Yes, I'm so excited to see. So yes, oftentimes first step, requesting those accommodations. Again, looking at ways to maintain employment is oftentimes going to be so important as one of those first steps. Now, in Michael's situation, he definitely did request those accommodations. He explored all accommodations, including maybe working from home, reassignment. Reassignment is actually part of the ADA. But even with those accommodations, he was having more and more difficulty maintaining employment, being productive, keeping up what his expectations were from the employer's perspective. So he was really grappling with this decision of maybe needing to separate from the workforce sooner than he had initially planned. Really, the progression of the MS sped up this process a little bit more for him. So in terms of those choices that you all just voted on, he actually did them all. He did consult with a financial planner because he did his homework and research to figure out what might my income look like if I do decide to pursue my employer-sponsored short-term and long-term disability. What is the income going to be? Again, that was one of the main reasons that he changed jobs, because he was fearful and wanted to be prepared for when or if that time came. So he explored the short-term and long-term disability benefits. He got educated. He did decide to once all those accommodations were no longer working for them, he tapped into the Family Medical Leave Act. He needed time off to try to see if there was any way to successfully return to work. During that period of time, he did tap into the employer's short-term disability, and after that decided that, you know what, I do need to pursue the disability. So he did eventually approve for long-term disability. Part of that long-term disability insurance carrier's requirement also did mandate that he does also apply for Social Security disability. So this is fairly common with those employer-sponsored private long-term disability insurance plans, where they're going to require the person apply for Social Security. So he's in the process, and what will happen when or if he does get approved for that Social Security, that long-term disability benefit will then subtract what he's getting in Social Security. But Roz, Michael's situation really brings up some important questions about how the employment decisions can impact the family. So would you be able to just talk a couple seconds about this?
In just a couple of seconds.
A couple minutes, a couple seconds or minutes.
I could spend a whole night talking about this, but I think it's important. We've been very much focused in this talk about the impact of employment changes on the person with MS. We just need to recognize that when there's a major transition for the person with MS, that does affect the whole family, and the family has feelings about it. They're also dealing with change and loss, and there's some grieving that the entire family needs to do together. Also, when a person with MS makes a major change or becomes unable to work, then there's often a shift in family roles. It may mean that a spouse or partner may need to take on more work or return to work. It may mean that the roles in the household shift, where people swap responsibilities or even engage outside help when needed. But the key thing that has to happen is that these changes have to somehow maintain the family rhythm so that the family can continue to thrive and meet the needs of all the family members in spite of the changes that happened. And for partners, I think when this kind of role shifting happens, it's very important for them to talk about how they can keep their partnership alive, balanced, and satisfying for both of them. You want to make sure that in a partnership, each person feels like he or she is giving and receiving in the partnership, and that each person, even if there have been employment changes, feels like a valued, contributing member of the household. And that doesn't happen without good communication and problem solving. And last but not least, couples need to be able to talk about how to maintain financial security for the family and stability over time. So it means really having some hard conversations about how to plan for the unpredictability of MS in the future. Fortunately, you all have lots of resources that can help you with this that are attached to the this presentation, but also on the next slide, you'll see some really important ones.
Yep. So again, we just quickly show here the National MS Society. We do have an entire page really focused on workplace employment career decisions. So nationalmssociety.org/employment. You can call our toll-free number 1-800-344-4867 and speak with an MS navigator. As Roz said, I do work very closely with our benefits, employment, and insurance support team. So we do have a smaller group of navigators that do specialize in providing resources and referrals, address questions and concerns in dealing with employment concerns. You see here a general email address too that does go directly to that team, so that employmentquestions@nmss.org. We would be more than happy to talk with you about disclosure accommodations, refer you to available resources like the state vocational rehab agencies, disability one-stops, or the career one-stops, which are comprehensive job centers, disability-friendly job boards, disability resources, and just talk people through the process when people might be contemplating separating from the workforce. And these next two slides are just show a sampling of some of the specific resources. As Roz said, these were also attached tonight, but we do have brochures that are geared towards the employer community, talking about that win-win approach. The next slide does highlight two of the resources that I use a lot that have been published by the Job Accommodation Network. And when you get the slides, all of these brochures have actually been like hyperlinks. So you can just click on that brochure picture and that will pull open that particular brochure. And the applying for Social Security disability benefits, again, this is an amazingly useful guide that Roz was directly involved in the development of for people who might be contemplating separating work and want to be knowledgeable about what Social Security disability benefits are going to look like, the process, and the important role that your healthcare provider plays. So please do reach out to us and explore some of these resources.
And in addition to these resources from the National MS Society and JAN, Can Do MS also offers a variety of online resources. Steve, in the last couple of years, did several excellent employment webinars that are archived on the Can Do MS website, and there are articles and other resources also online. So be sure to check those out as well.
Alrighty, and thank you so much, Steve and Roz, for that great information, and so helpful no matter what stage of your MS journey you're in. Just really helpful tips and strategies and resources to think about. We have a few minutes for some questions and answers, and thank you for everyone for submitting your questions. We only have a few minutes, and so I will tell you about ways to submit questions to get answered at the end if we don't have time to get to your question. So, Roz, I'd like to start with you. We had a number of people write-ins about concerns about some mood changes that they're going through, whether it's increased anger or lowered self-esteem, or responding inappropriately, laughing or crying at the wrong times. And they're concerned about these changes in mood manifesting itself in the workplace. Do you have any tips or ideas of how to kind of get ahead of some of those and manage those before it may become an issue in the workplace?
Of course. So mood issues are another reason that people commonly leave the workforce. We know, first of all, that depression is very, very common in people with MS, and there's nothing like being very, very depressed to have difficulty engaging with people, completing tasks, maintaining your self-confidence, or even caring. So given how common it is in MS, upwards of 50% of people will experience depression over the course of the disease. The very best advice I can give is to talk to your healthcare provider and get screened quickly for these kinds of mood changes. The other reason it's important to be screened for depression is that if you're also experiencing some cognitive changes, the first step to dealing with those cognitive changes or problems with thinking, memory, concentration, decision-making is to evaluate you for depression, because if you're depressed, that makes your cognition worse. So the very first thing you need to do is to deal with the mood issues, because then some of the cognitive issues you're experiencing may start to feel better. Laughing and crying is a different kind of symptom. It's not a mood problem. It's called a mood expression problem. It's the technical term for it is pseudobulbar affect, and it means that people begin to laugh uncontrollably or cry uncontrollably in situations where they're not feeling anything like those emotions. They may not feel sad at all when they cry. They may not feel particularly happy or in good humor when they laugh. It is a neurologic change that can occur in about 10% of people with MS. It is very, very treatable. So your very first step with any mood changes like this, or irritability and temper outbursts, is to talk to your doctor and get an appropriate evaluation from a mental health provider.
Excellent. Thank you, Roz. You mentioned cognition, and this viewer wrote, I just graduated from college and will be entering the workplace for the first time. I struggle mostly with cognition. For a first-time job seeker, how do I find a career or job that I'll enjoy and be successful in? And how do I know if I'll succeed at a job if I don't try it first?
You know, Steve, please weigh in here, but I think this is an excellent opportunity to meet with a vocational rehabilitation counselor, to talk through employment options and perhaps find out what exactly is going on with the cognition, how you might develop some strategies to deal with those cognitive changes so that they interfere as little as possible. But this is where voc rehab counselors can really be hugely helpful.
Yeah. I was definitely going to suggest that too, Roz. So within each state, there is a state mandated agency. It's called different things in different states: vocational rehab, Department of Rehab Services. The goal of that agency is to assist people with disabilities in gaining and maintaining employment. So they can do everything from vocational assessments, neuropsychological assessments, job development and placement assistance, follow along services, career interest related testing and inventories, as well as just that vocational guidance and counseling. Let's just help you focus on what type of work might be appropriate for you to look for, and what sorts of strategies might you be able to utilize to increase the likelihood of your success. All of the state VR agencies are linked on the Job Accommodation Network, or you can definitely contact us at the National MS Society, and we actually maintain a full list of the state VR. And then we also do have some kind of useful tips and tricks in terms of kind of how to get the most out of the state VR.
Excellent, thank you.
Can I just say one more thing, Brian? I'm just so glad that this person asked that question, because it goes back again to that early slide about the importance of work in our lives, that for you to reach out, go to a voc rehab counselor and really learn about what would give you the biggest satisfaction and the highest degree of success is so critically important to your identity, particularly at this stage in your life. So I'm glad you asked the question, and please go get that assist.
It's a great question. Thank you. I think we have time for two more. Steve, you mentioned that one of the disadvantages perhaps of disclosing is the perception of preferential treatment. So this viewer wrote, I believe strongly in being a good teammate, especially at my job. What is a good way to take the time off that I need to manage my MS without feeling that I'm letting my work team down? And maybe you can talk a little bit about animosity in the workplace and some tips to sort of head that off.
This is a really tricky one. So I am thankful that somebody asked this, because I think this is a really common fear that people have. I'm going to talk first just about the appearance of getting preferential treatment. I think what's important to do is, and again, here's where part of this disclosure is controlling how much information and who knows it. I've worked with some people who don't want to tell their colleagues what's going on, and I've worked with some people who might choose to. And if you, again, this is a very personal decision. I cannot say, yes, definitely tell all your coworkers what is going on. But if you fear, if there is that type of apprehension, you might consider talking about it more. Again, from a disclosure perspective, you may only have to talk to your direct supervisor or someone from HR. And the other thing is that disclosure is to be kept confidential. So even if you're getting different types of accommodations, if you can work from home and nobody else does, it's nobody's business. That employer, that supervisor should not be disclosing the reason why you have that ability to work from home. But if you think that it might help, to reduce some of those things, that's where you want to control the information. I think in terms of being a team player, there are ways that you can support your team in different ways than needing to stay late, for instance. Or if there is a project that you can take home with you, so you're still seen as being part of that team and pulling your weight, if you have that ability, if you have the energy, and if that's something that you might be interested in, that might be something that you can offer for you to go to that person and say, you know what, and again, you don't necessarily have to give any reason why. If you say, you know what, I'm not able to stay late on such and such date, but might there be something that I can help out to support this project when I'm back in the office tomorrow? Or might I be able to take some of this work home with me? Again, if you do have that ability from a fatigue level, but those are kind of some of the tactics that I have heard people try to use.
And you know, to build on that, this may be one of those circumstances where you decide that sharing the information with your colleagues benefits everybody. If you put your teaching hat on and let them know about MS fatigue or any other symptom that you're having that they can't see or understand, then you can assure them that with these accommodations, you will be able to be as good or better a team member than you've been before. So you have to weigh the pros and cons of that, but that's exactly the kind of situation where being open and educating your colleagues can work in your benefit.
That's great. Thank you so much. We'll go into overtime here with one final question. We have a number of parents on the webinar tonight, and two moms wrote in, and both with similar questions. And they fear that the career that their children are pursuing may be too stressful for them, especially as their MS may progress. How do you talk to a child about transitioning to a new career for one that may be too much for them to handle?
Well, I'm going to jump in here.
I was going to say, Roz, I'm going to let you start, but then I'm going to talk about the different type of transferable skills. So I'm going to let you start off here, Roz.
I think it's important for people to understand the role of stress here. I know that parents worry. I'm a parent of an adult child, and there are two key points I want to make in this short amount of time. One, we don't know the direct link between stress and MS. The research is very mixed on this, and you know, if you give up something that you truly love in order to avoid stress, that may be more stressful. You may just be producing a different kind of stress because the work that you love contributes a lot to your life and your sense of who you are. The second thing is that adults, even if they're young adults living with MS, need to make these decisions. However much we love them as mothers, we kind of need to back off and let our adult children work things out with their healthcare team, with their advisors, with people like Steve at the National MS Society. It really is something that at this point in life, they need to be deciding for themselves so that they make the decisions that work for them. And I don't say that easily as a mom, but I really think that's important advice to you.
And the other thing too, and kind of thinking back to Patty's situation, might there be a way to utilize that interest, that degree, but in a less physically demanding manner? I think that's also just something to keep in mind. Again, from a vocational exploration perspective, from a career change, or just looking at the different paths that people can take with a certain degree. It doesn't have to be an automatic, oh my gosh, this is going to be such a physically demanding position. I think, again, there are so many different careers and occupations out there that people can use a wide range of degrees and backgrounds, and hopefully still manage the symptoms. So.
Well, it's all great advice, and thank you so much for staying a little bit later to answer some questions. And hopefully we got to your question tonight. So again, thank you so much all for coming. Roz and Steve, any closing words to leave us with tonight?
Thank you for hanging in there for such a long time. And I will look forward to seeing as many of you as possible next week.
And thank you so much for letting me be part of this program.
All right. Thank you both so much. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thanks so much.